In June of 1940, a young commission warrant candidate named John Arthur reported aboard the Flower-class corvette HMS Anemone carrying nothing but a sea bag and a hammock. The ship was barely 200 feet long, designed as a 5-day North Sea patrol vessel from a whaler hull. Now the Admiralty was sending it into the open Atlantic. The forecastle was so short that green seawater crashed over it in any kind of weather. The mess decks flooded regularly through the anchor chain pipes, and the air below stank of wet wool and vomit. Smith's Dock in Middlesbrough adapted their standard whaler design into what became the Flower class. But these were coastal patrol boats with a 5-day endurance, not transatlantic convoy escorts. The magnetic compass was the only navigation aid. The main anti-submarine weapon was a depth charge from the last war, and the crews were men who had never worn a uniform until the week before. John Arthur was seasick for 4 straight days. He lived on hot water, Bovril, and dry biscuits. But he learned the first rule of corvette life. You got on with the job. You did not complain. You did not slow down. You adapted because the convoy would not wait. He was one of the lucky ones. After those 4 days, the motion no longer bothered him. Others never fully adjusted, and they carried out their duties pale and sweating, watch after watch. A few months later, in October of 1940, a hostilities-only seaman named Cyril Stevens walked onto a dock in Hull. The tide was out, and at first he saw nothing but mud. Then he looked down. There, in the basin, lay a tiny ship covered in rust and cables, the corvette HMS Orchis. Dockyard workers crawled over her like ants. There was no electricity on board. It was pitch black and freezing cold. Stevens and the other new hands found their way around by torchlight, feeling their way through unfamiliar passageways. He stood on the freezing deck, staring at the rust-streaked forecastle. The ship felt impossibly small for the ocean they would soon cross. In the wheelhouse, bolted to a stanchion beside the magnetic compass, hung a galvanized bucket, placed there deliberately for the seasickness every man knew was coming. The compass itself was a simple instrument, a liquid-filled card that swung wildly with every roll. It was all they had for navigation until someone invented something better. The crew of Orchis was a cross-section of civilian Britain. There were painters, bricklayers, carpenters, and hairdressers, all thrown together and told to become sailors. A few regular Navy men formed the backbone, the coxswain, a couple of leading hands, a chief engine room artificer. Everyone else had to learn from scratch. They drilled on the 4-inch gun, practiced loading depth charges, and learned how to steer by that swinging magnetic compass. They learned fast because the ship was needed at sea. By the summer of 1941, Orchis had completed her fitting out and conducted her sea trials. Now she sailed for Tobermory in the Inner Hebrides, the Royal Navy's working-up base. The officer in charge was Commodore Stevenson, a retired vice-admiral known up and down the fleet as the Terror of Tobermory. He ran a brutal training course designed to break bad habits before they formed. He sent commando teams aboard at night to test the watchkeepers, and he expected every deficiency to be corrected by morning. Orchis entered Tobermory harbour with a strong wind blowing hard. The current caught her and pushed her toward another ship lying at anchor. HMS Canna Stevens watched from the deck as the bow of Orchis struck Canna's stern, crumpling her own forward plates. The crew braced for an explosion of temper. Within minutes, a signal arrived from Commodore Stevenson. The men would repair the damage themselves. No dockyard. No outside help. They would rig the staging, cut the steel, and weld the new plates with their own hands. For days, the crew of Orchis worked on their own ship. Seamen became shipwrights. Stokers became welders. When the job was finished, the new plates fit perfectly. Stevenson inspected the work and said nothing, but the silence carried its own approval. Somewhere in that brutal week, a collection of painters, bricklayers, and hairdressers had become a fighting team. They were ready for their first convoy. By early 1942, the pattern of the Atlantic War had settled into a brutal rhythm. Convoys assembled off the coast of Ireland, sometimes 40 merchant ships, sometimes twice that number, and formed into columns stretching for miles. The escort screen was desperately thin, 1 destroyer and perhaps 4 corvettes to protect them all. At the convoy conference before sailing, the captains received their station assignments and the Commodore set the course. Once beyond the swept channel and into open water, the corvettes took up their positions on the flanks and astern. The slowest ship set the pace, sometimes 7 knots, and any vessel that could not hold that speed fell behind. Stragglers became easy targets. A corvette would be detached to round them up, her captain shouting through a loud hailer, urging more smoke from the funnel, more speed from the engine. Fuel remained the great limitation. A corvette carried roughly 200 tons of oil, enough for perhaps 10 days at economical speed. To extend their reach across the Atlantic, the escorts began refueling at sea. The tanker would trail a wooden float on a light line astern. The corvette would maneuver alongside, and a seaman with a grappling hook would snag the line. Roy Dykes recalled the procedure well. Once the float was brought on board, the hose was hauled up and connected to the ship's inlet, and the oil began to flow. Meanwhile, far from the refueling lines, a different revolution was being tested. Off the coast of Newfoundland, HMS Clematis made the first operational attack with a new weapon called the Hedgehog. Instead of dropping depth charges astern, it fired 24 contact-fused mortars ahead of the ship. Frank Richmond was on board Clematis that day, and he remembered the tension on the bridge as the ASDIC operator reported a firm underwater contact. Action stations sounded. The crew of Clematis rushed to their positions. The Hedgehog was trained on the bearing. The order to fire was given. Nothing happened. The impeller caps that armed the mortars when they hit the water were still fitted, and no one had remembered to remove them. The U-boat, aware it was being hunted, took evasive action. The contact was lost. The attack was aborted. The caps were hastily removed from all 24 mortars. A second attack was made, and this time the Hedgehog fired successfully. The pattern of splashes rose ahead of the ship, and seconds later a series of deep, muffled explosions rolled back across the water. The Hedgehog would become a standard weapon, but the lesson was a sharp one. New technology required new drills, and those drills had to be learned under pressure. The equipment looked like something from a workshop. The aerial was mounted on a long pole, and to rotate it, the operator turned a handle at the base, connected by a bicycle chain. The display was a small screen, about 12 inches wide, with a green glowing baseline known as the grass. An echo appeared as a peak rising from that grass, and the operator had to judge its bearing and range by hand. For the first time, a corvette could see in the dark. Surfaced U-boats, which had moved with impunity at night to charge their batteries and close on the convoy, could now be detected before they attacked. The advantage shifted. The U-boat commander could no longer be certain that darkness concealed him. The crew of Orkis, like the crews of other corvettes receiving the new sets, began to learn a new kind of watchkeeping, watching a green screen instead of a black horizon. Through the summer of 1942, more innovations arrived. The gyro compass replaced the magnetic compass on many corvettes, giving a steady reference unaffected by the ship's roll or magnetic disturbances. The Hedgehog, after the initial failure, became a reliable weapon. Crews trained intensively in its use, firing practice patterns and refining their attack runs. The officer training schools in Liverpool and Londonderry ran courses in tactics, radar, and ASDIC, turning raw officers into effective hunters. Montague Holinshed, first lieutenant on HMS Oxlip, remembered the constant drill. Every day at sea, in the dog watches, the crew practiced action stations. Every man knew his position in the dark. Every man knew his job. The cumulative effect was measurable. The escort groups became more coordinated, more deadly. The U-boats found it harder to press home an attack without being counterattacked themselves. By the autumn of 1942, the corvettes were no longer the same ships that had gone to sea in 1940. They carried radar. They carried reliable ahead-throwing weapons. They carried crews that had learned their trade through months of cold, wet, and danger. But the enemy had also learned. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had built his wolf packs into a formidable force, and he was ready to test the escort groups as never before. In October 1942, the U-boats struck with ferocity. Ships were torpedoed in darkness, their holds ruptured, their cargoes lost. The corvettes rushed to depth-charge contacts while merchantmen burned and sank. Geoffrey Drummond, serving on HMS Campion, remembered the chaos of those nights, the dull thud of a torpedo striking home, the sudden glare of a ship on fire, the urgent signals from the senior officer ordering the screen to close up. The pattern of attack was relentless. One escort would drive off a U-boat on the starboard bow, and another would appear on the port quarter. The corvettes steamed back and forth, dropping depth charges in patterns, reloading and dropping again. The work was exhausting. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off, but the off-watch was often broken by action stations. Sleep came in short, stolen moments between attacks. When dawn broke, the survivors would be found. Some were in lifeboats, some clinging to wreckage, many covered in thick fuel oil that clogged their lungs and burned their skin. The corvettes would stop, lower their boats, and haul the men on board. The rescued were given dry clothing and a place to lie down. The dead were buried at sea, sewn into canvas, and slipped over the side with a prayer. Then the corvette would rejoin the convoy and resume the watch. It was October of 1942 when a Liberator bomber, its engines trailing smoke, appeared on the horizon above the North Atlantic convoy, on board HMS Pink. Captain Robert Atkinson watched as the aircraft ditched. The plane somersaulted on impact and sank quickly. The Pink rushed to the spot and recovered the crew. One man was dead, and another had a compound leg fracture. Atkinson buried the two dead at sea with a brief service. That same night, dense fog and icebergs closed around the ship. Pink asked permission to enter St. John's Harbour, but was told the port was closed after dark, except for a 15-minute window at midnight. Atkinson did not wait. He cut south 20 miles, steered straight inshore, and posted 20 lookouts along the deck. "The first thing you'll see are the cliffs," he told them. "If you see them, you'll be 100 feet from them. The first person who hears anything, shout like hell." For a long hour, the ship crept forward in silence. Then Atkinson himself heard it, the deep hoo-hoo of the Newfoundland foghorn. He ordered full speed ahead. The harbour lights blazed on, guiding the way. Within minutes, Pink was alongside, and ambulances whisked the wounded man away, but the battle was far from over. By late April of 1943, the North Atlantic had become a battleground of weather as much as of men. Convoy Orness, 42 merchant ships, and a handful of escorts departed from Derry. The winter storms had not released their grip. Mountainous seas swept over the tiny corvettes. Deck lockers were torn away by the force of the waves. The ships could not make headway. The convoy was effectively stationary for days. The crew of HMS Anemone, with John Arthur on board, felt the ship corkscrew up and down in troughs deeper than the mast. Seasickness was relentless, but watchdogs never let up. They feared the sea itself more than any submarine. On the 4th day of May, the gales died as suddenly as they had come. A dense fog settled over the water. The stillness was eerie. And then the wolf packs came. U-boats surfaced in the dim light, their hulls black against the mist. They struck without warning. Torpedoes ran straight into the convoy's heart. Tankers erupted in pillars of flame. Geoffrey Drummond, aboard HMS Campion, remembered the dull thud of explosions that meant a ship had been hit. The escort group, a handful of destroyers and corvettes, responded immediately. The destroyer HMS Duncan sank 4 U-boats in a single day. The corvettes dropped depth charges in relentless patterns. The sea shook. The survivors of the sinking merchantmen scrambled into lifeboats, coated in thick fuel oil that clogged their lungs. The corvette crews lowered boats and hauled them aboard, using scrambled nets and sheer muscle. One of the escort group was HMS Snowflake, and on board was a young sick berth attendant named Howard Goldsmith. He had trained for only 9 weeks before being sent to sea, but now he was the only medical man on board. For 5 days after the battle, while the convoy limped westward, Goldsmith treated survivors of the merchant ship Richmond Castle. They had been adrift for 14 days before rescue. One man had gangrene in his legs, another had pleurisy, others had burns and shock. Goldsmith used only primitive supplies, salt water for antiseptic, calamine for burns, and sheer willpower to keep the men alive. He cleaned their wounds, dressed the burns, and sat with them through the long nights. By the time they reached harbour, all of them were still breathing. It was a quiet victory, invisible to the record books. Meanwhile, the convoy battle raged on. The depth charges were loaded and fired again and again. Each pattern required a fresh pistol and a serial-numbered key, the same system Roy Dykes had earlier recorded on the depth charge history certificates. The men manning the rails worked automatically, set the depth, arm the charge, push it over the side, then brace for the explosion. The U-boats did not let up. They attacked through the night and into the next day, but the escorts held the screen. They drove off wolf pack after wolf pack, and though several merchant ships were lost, the convoy did not break. The cost was heavy, but the core of the force pushed through. By the middle of May 1943, the toll had become intolerable for the German command. Grand Admiral Dönitz, the architect of the wolf pack strategy, watched his losses mount. In the battle around convoy ONSS alone, 7 U-boats had been sunk. His crews were experienced men who could not be quickly replaced. The decision came: withdraw the wolf packs from the North Atlantic. The order was sent. For the first time in years, the convoys could cross the mid-Atlantic without the constant shadow of death lurking below. Long-range Liberator aircraft now closed the gap that had once been the U-boat's sanctuary. The tide had turned, but for Howard Goldsmith, the war was not over. He continued his duties on Snowflake, treating the sick and wounded. The ship's cat, named U-boat by the crew, had a hammock and a tiny life jacket of its own. It was a source of warmth and distraction. Goldsmith once watched the cat get drunk on rum during a birthday party. The crew poured it a saucerful with evaporated milk. The cat staggered, collapsed, and slept it off. The next morning, the captain discovered what U-boat had left behind in his wardroom chair. The punishment was swift. At the next port in Newfoundland, U-boat was put ashore. The crew watched him disappear into the fog and never saw him again. It was a small human moment in the midst of the horror. Harold Chesterman, commanding HMS Snowflake, had been with corvettes since the early days. He remembered the morning after the worst of the attacks, when the sea was littered with wreckage and bodies. The survivors were brought aboard, their faces black with oil. They were given dry clothes and hot food. Some died even then. Chesterman ordered the burial at sea, the canvas-wrapped body sliding from the board under the white ensign. There was no time for grief. The convoy had to move. After ONSS, the escort group was given a brief respite in St. John's. The crew of Campion and Snowflake went ashore to the wooden huts of the base. They bought nylon stockings and fruit to send home. The letters they wrote were censored by their officers. They spoke only of the weather. The real story stayed with them, but the Battle of the Atlantic was not yet over. There were more convoys, more attacks, yet the character of the war had changed. The corvettes now carried reliable radar, ahead-throwing weapons, and gyro compasses. The crews had become hardened professionals. They had learned that the sea could be as deadly as any torpedo, and that survival depended on each man doing his job without question. The bonds they forged in those freezing, oil-soaked nights would last a lifetime. John Arthur, still on Anemone, reflected on the fear that never quite left. It was a cold fear, he said, the kind that crept up when you heard the water rushing past the thin steel hull. But you kept moving. You attended to your duty. The discipline of the corvette was not parade ground discipline. It was the discipline of survival. Everyone depended on everyone else. That was the only way to make it through. By the summer of 1943, the U-boats were withdrawing from the deep ocean. The battle had reached its climax. Donitz's wolf packs had been broken. The long-range liberators, finally released by the Strategic Command, prowled the skies over the entire Atlantic route. The gap was closed. The convoys could breathe. For Howard Goldsmith, the turning point was personal. The Richmond Castle survivors came back to health slowly. Some of them would never fully recover, but they were alive. He had done what he could with salt water and bandages. That was enough. Geoffrey Drummond, now a torpedo coxswain, remembered the sound of a ship breaking up, the screech of metal, and the roar of escaping steam. He learned to block it out. His job was to lower the boat, pick up survivors, and return to the ship to reload depth charges. There was no room for sentiment. Roy Dykes, serving on another corvette, recalled the precise procedure of firing a depth charge pattern. Each charge had a pistol with a depth setting. After the attack, you had to fill out a history certificate for each pistol used. He once wrote "bang" in the space for description of explosion. The officer accepted it with a wry smile. These small rituals helped the men cope. Cyril Stevens on Orkis kept the ship's routines alive. He remembered the tot of rum issued daily and how it brought the mess together. In harbour they went ashore to the pubs, but the sea always called them back. The corvette was their home, and they loved her for her stubborn survival. The autumn of 1943 saw fewer losses. The escort groups had become efficient. The support groups, newly formed, hunted U-boats rather than just driving them off. The balance had shifted permanently. The Battle of the Atlantic was still not over, but the back of the enemy had been broken. Harold Chesterman, commanding Snowflake on convoy HX-231, saw the change with his own eyes. The merchant ships no longer zigzagged in panic. They kept their stations. The escorts moved with confidence. The wolf packs had scattered. For the men who had fought through the gauntlet of 1942 and early 1943, it was a profound relief. But the cost was never forgotten. The empty bunks in the mess decks. The letters that stopped coming. The nights when you heard the cries of survivors in the water and could not stop to pick them up. The corvette crews carried these memories silently. They did not speak of them. They only did their duty. By early 1944, the Flower-class corvettes had survived the worst the Atlantic could throw at them. The wolf packs had withdrawn, but the war was far from over. Now a new task awaited these small ships. In the months leading up to June, dozens of corvettes were pulled from convoy duty and reassembled along the southern coast of England. Their objective was not the deep ocean, but the beaches of Normandy. On the 6th of June, D-Day, the corvettes went to work. They escorted troop ships across the Channel, their decks crowded with soldiers in full battle gear. They swept for mines ahead of the landing craft. They stood guard against any U-boat that might slip through the protective screen. For the men of these little ships, it was a strange and crowded sea, packed with thousands of vessels, a far cry from the lonely miles of the North Atlantic. After the beaches were secured, many corvettes returned to their old trade. The Atlantic convoy still needed protection, even if the enemy was no longer the threat he once had been. But the ships themselves had changed. During refits in British yards, the short forecastles were extended. The mess decks became less of a swimming pool. The galley was no longer a gauntlet of crashing waves. A man could now carry a pot of stew from the stove to his mess without wearing half of it on his chest. These were the years of slow improvement. Radar sets that had once been experimental were now standard. Sick bays appeared, complete with a proper bunk for the sick berth attendant. The daily tot of rum still arrived at 11 bells, and the cocoa still steamed in the galley, but the edge had gone out of the danger. The crews began to relax, just a little. For the crews, the war began to take on a different rhythm. The convoys still crossed the Atlantic, but the pace was steadier, the nights quieter. In ports like St. John's and Halifax, the men went ashore and filled their sea bags with goods that were scarce back home. Nylon stockings, tins of ham, bars of American chocolate all found their way into the lockers. These were not luxuries for the sailors themselves. They were gifts for wives and sweethearts waiting in England. The letters home became the thread that held lives together. A man off watch would sit by a red-shaded lamp and write about the weather, never about the war. The censor's scissors cut out anything that gave away a position or a destination, but the women reading those letters knew how to read between the lines. A long delay meant a hard trip. A sudden flurry of letters meant the ship was in port. On the home front, the waiting was its own kind of battle. Iris Dykes, married to Roy, remembered the mail as the only link. She would read each letter twice, then fold it carefully back into the envelope. Hilda Stevens, whose wedding to Cyril had been postponed 3 times by convoy schedules, learned to live with uncertainty. She kept the house ready, the curtains washed, the photographs on the mantelpiece. The end of the war was a hope she did not dare to believe in fully. Then, in the first week of May 1945, the news arrived. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. On the corvettes, still at sea, the signal flags ran up the halyards. Men who had spent years staring at a grey horizon found themselves grinning without knowing why. In port, the crews poured ashore. In Londonderry, in Liverpool, in Greenock, the pubs did business they had not seen since before the war. The celebrations did not last long. Soon the Admiralty began paying off the Flower-class corvettes. The ships that had endured the worst of the Battle of the Atlantic were run up onto mudflats and stripped of their gear. Grown men, sailors who had stared down U-boats and Atlantic gales, found themselves crying as they walked down the gangplank for the last time. The ships that had been their home for 3 and 4 years were being taken apart. The crews scattered back to civilian life. The painters, bricklayers, carpenters, and hairdressers who had become seamen and gunners put away their uniforms. The fear, the cold, the long nights on watch began to recede into memory, but the bond did not break. It simply waited. For years, the men of the corvettes went back to their old trades, raised families, and told no one what they had seen. The memories remained locked inside them, like a depth charge set to a depth they could not name. After the war ended, the crews scattered home. Roy Dykes returned to accounting and later the Royal Naval Reserve. Geoffrey Drummond stayed in the Navy until 1973, retiring as a Fleet Chief Petty Officer. Howard Goldsmith and Cyril Stevens were demobilized into civilian life. John Arthur was demobilized as a lieutenant in 1946 and rarely spoke of the war, but he never forgot the corvette's cold fear. Harold Chesterman returned to Australia, joined the Australian Commonwealth Lifeboat Service, and retired as a captain in 1972. Frank Richmond was demobilized as a lieutenant and later became a company president. Sidney Wright remained in electrical engineering until his retirement in 1978. Montague Holinshed was demobilized in 1946 and later served in the Royal Naval Reserve, retiring in 1965. Sir Robert Atkinson was demobilized as a lieutenant commander in 1946. The bond between shipmates went quiet for 35 years. It had not disappeared. In 1980, Stevens placed a small ad in Navy News. He asked for shipmates from HMS Orcus. The response caught him off guard. Letters arrived from Larry Mansell, from Bob Davis, from men he had not seen since the war ended. Stevens opened each envelope and read every name. He could still put a face to every one. On a Saturday in May 1981, 36 former corvette men met at the Royal Naval Association Club in Leamington Spa. They were greyer now, some nearly unrecognizable. But within minutes, the old shipboard feeling returned. They called each other by forgotten nicknames and talked about ships scrapped decades ago. Before the afternoon ended, the Flower-class Corvette Association was born. The association grew to over 1,000 members from around the world. Annual reunions became a tradition, along with Sea Sunday services at South Cerney. Kenneth Hannon, an American who served on HMS Candytuft, presented a glass bowl that sits at every gathering. Former enemies became friends. The bond forged in the Atlantic was now preserved by memory. The corvettes are long gone, run up on mudflats and cut up for scrap. But the men still gather each year. For a few hours, they are back on a small wet ship in the North Atlantic. As Stevens put it is as though they are back together on one big corvette. That is the legacy, not the ships themselves, but the stubborn bond they forced into existence. If you have a family story from the Battle of the Atlantic, share it in the comments below. We read everyone. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to help us bring more of these histories to light. Thank you sincerely for listening.